Good afternoon and welcome to Many Paths, Many Visions, brought to you by the Labyrinth Society and with your host, Christiana Brinton. Today I am speaking with Jeff Saward, the world's preeminent labyrinth historian and full-time maze and labyrinth sleuth, who is one of the featured speakers at this year's 20th anniversary gathering. If you are joining us on this GoToMeeting session, please mute your sound by clicking on the microphone icon in the upper left of the GoToMeeting control panel. It'll appear on your computer screen once you log in. If you call in by phone, you will not see this. You can unmute yourselves and ask questions during the Q&A session at the end of the interview. Find the GoToMeeting invitation posted on the TLS Facebook page, the Facebook Global Group, and on the website under Media. So this episode I've entitled Following Ariadne's Thread for 42 Years, highlights some musings of an intrepid English explorer. And I had to say that because this guy's from Great Britain, and you think about Great Britain and all the wonderful, amazing English explorers that came out of there, and the sailors and everything. He is a labyrinth explorer, and he's a well-known figure in the labyrinth world. He's written, contributed, and edited many books on the subject of labyrinths and mazes, and is one of the founding members of the Labyrinth Society. Greetings, Jeff. Welcome to Many Paths, Many Visions. Thank you for joining me today.
Good afternoon, or good evening as it is over here on the other side of the Atlantic.
Yes, so, and you sound like you're right next door, so this is wonderful. It's terrific. It's amazing.
The wonders of modern technology.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the title of your gathering presentation this year is The Long and Winding Road. And from my take on what the blurb said in your bio, above your bio on the gathering pages on the website, to me, what you're going to do, is, among other things, is illuminate the many seemingly disparate threads that intertwine and interwove to create this synchronistic grouping of people, visionaries, who birthed this labyrinth organization, imbued with each person's unique vision, expertise, and skill set. It was a very unique thing that happened 20 years ago. So in your over 40 years of experience with labyrinths, do you believe now, looking back on this, that this was just a fortuitous coincidence or a result of working with labyrinth energy?
I think it was one of those events whose time had come. There was a need for labyrinth enthusiasts to be able to share their skills and their knowledge and their enthusiasm. And I certainly recall from being at those early meetings where the Labyrinth Society was founded, it grew out of a number of meetings that were held actually over a period of some years prior to the founding of the Society, where every year, 1995, 1996, 97, and then 98, a group of increasingly enthusiastic labyrinth folk got together and each time said, we must do this again. And after a few years of it being done on a very voluntary shoestring basis, it was kind of decided, hey, we need to put our heads together and actually figure out some way of making this happen on a regular basis and creating this organization that has the skill set and the capability and the finances to actually make these things happen. So yeah, there's labyrinth energy there because all of these people were labyrinth enthusiasts, but it was very much, I think, their enthusiasm that allowed it to happen. You know, the time was right, the people were there, it happened.
So it was almost a very organic process. It took many years to the seed to be planted and to, blossom into, a plant and then the flower. It was a very organic kind of process that happened. It didn't happen overnight. And the people, it seemed, so what you're saying is that every time these people came together, it made more sense to keep going and keep.
Yeah. There was, you know, some of the people who were involved obviously are still very much involved with the society now, and other folk have come along more recently. But you know, there was this core group back in the early days who had this, you know, enthusiasm and the skills, you know, the ability to actually organise the event, to book a venue, to network with people, and bear in mind that all of this kind of happened. And indeed, one of the key things that really allowed it to happen, it was in the mid-1990s, the latter half of the 1990s. It was that point in time where the internet came into existence, where instead of actually having to place a long distance phone call and sit and listen to all those weird dial tones and work out what the heck they meant, you could actually use this newfangled thing called email and send a message to somebody. And if they happened to be sitting next to their computer, they could get straight back to you. And this all happened at that time. I remember 1996, when our own organisation, Labyrinthos, or certainly the journal Kaya Droya, went online for the first time in 1996. You know, this was an incredible breakthrough to be able to communicate and share information with people around the world via computers, via the internet in particular. And this grouping of labyrinth enthusiasts, some of them were quite computer savvy and were able to use those skills as well to, you know, all of these things fell into place at the time.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, so that is all part of that whole synchronicity. I mean, it's all just sort of developing absolutely. At the same time, and very interesting. So, and you said that, you know, everybody had their own skill sets, everybody had their own expertise, and just a quick, like, can you give me an example of when people butted heads, or when it was kind of an amusing kind of thing where some people had one vision and other people had a different take on that vision? And
oh
you
yeah,
have a favorite story?
Bit careful here about not naming folk, but
right,
I mean,
don't name names.
Some of those early meetings of the, you know, that founded the society, you know, there were sometimes 20 and other times 40 people in the room, you know, 40 different ideas and 40 different opinions of how something should be done. You know, the early board of TLS, when it was first created, you know, there was something like about 20 people on the board. It took forever to come to any kind of decision because there were 20 different opinions of how it should be done. And consequently, you know, things have kind of slimmed themselves down and become a little more efficient since those days. But that was, you know, how it was. You know, that was what enthusiasm was all about. And yeah, there were a few occasions where, you know, there were different camps, shall we say. You know, there was one group that had an opinion about how this should happen and what this should be called, what that committee should be responsible for doing. And another camp that had a completely different idea. And, you know, there were a few falling outs, but hey, it was family, and that's what family does, you know. There's always a bit of an argument around the table, but at the end of the day, everyone sits down and eats a meal.
Yeah, and hashing out all of this kind of stuff had to be done creating a new organization. I mean, you can't sit down or walk your issues out and then come back and sit down. You know, that's the whole point of having that labyrinth there. One very good use of the labyrinth is to walk out the you know, the angst, and be able to come back and sit down and think more clearly, or interact with each other. So,
oh yeah, and quite a few of those early meetings, there was always either a canvas labyrinth laid out in an adjacent room, or there was a labyrinth outside on the grounds, you know, of the meeting place wherever we were, however sort of permanent or temporary. And yeah, people would frequently go out there and walk them, you know, to clear their heads and focus their opinions and thoughts. But yeah, they were fun, enthusiastic days, and you know, we were all. You know, we all had professional skills, but we were all amateurs at creating a labyrinth organization, because no one had really ever done anything quite like this before.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. Thank you for sharing that. That's you know, that was, I always love to hear what some of the founding members have to say, and I you know, I've interviewed David, and I've interviewed David Gallagher and Annette Reynolds, and now yourself, and it's fascinating, and Neil Harris, and it's fascinating.
Of course,
to hear.
Helen Curry was another very
Yeah.
key person in that stage of creating the society, because she was the one that actually had the experience of creating non-profits and all of that kind of stuff, and the legal and financial frameworks that were required. So, you know, everyone brought these different skills to the table.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about your avocation. Vocation, avocation. Yeah. You've done a tremendous years and years of historical research on labyrinths and mazes. Have you identified any repeated or repeating themes that appear throughout recorded human history as far as labyrinth designs? Are they? Is there some kind of connection, or are they just? Do you think they're just random occurrences?
I don't think they're random. The periods during which labyrinths become popular and widespread, excuse me, and likewise in more recent times, mazes at the same time, actually. Those periods where labyrinths flourish and spread and the designs develop, they often, when you look back in time, appear to piggyback themselves on advances in human technology, shall we say. So, for instance, when the Roman Empire flourished and the Romans took their culture from one end of Europe to another, and into North Africa, and through their trade links to places like India and so forth, the labyrinth went with them. It was a key part of their mythology, but the labyrinth symbol travelled wherever they went and appeared on the floors as mosaics in their buildings from one end of the Roman Empire to another. In the medieval period, with the establishment of scriptoriums and monasteries and schools, the labyrinth spread in manuscripts from one end of Europe to another. And you've got all of these different periods of time when new ideas come along. For instance, in the 15th century, the creation of printing presses allowed labyrinths to be circulated far and wide in early books of architecture and of gardening, where there are illustrations of labyrinth designs. And for the first time there, you could actually transmit the design of quite complex labyrinths on a page that could be replicated over and over again and didn't actually.
Jeff, you just went out. We can't hear you. Can you fix your mic?
Have to be redrawn by hand each time. Hello?
Yeah. Hello?
Do you hear me?
I can hear you now, but
hello? Can you hear me? All right. Okay.
Who's this?
Perhaps we've had a few problems with our internet in the last few days, so maybe we've got a connection problem.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you just fine. You did drop out for a couple of minutes there.
Yeah. Okay.
So
that's probably our internet connection here.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So you had lots of these labyrinths spreading at the same time as the creation of printing, for instance.
Yeah.
There were lots of labyrinths in the 19th century when mechanical printing and the setting up of schools and libraries spread the idea. And as I pointed out just a short moment ago, there was a huge spread of knowledge of labyrinths with the creation of the internet 25 years ago. Each time one of these advances in information technology and comes along, labyrinths piggyback on the back of those and spread themselves further and further afield.
So you don't think that like the Chakravyuha labyrinth that's found in India is an anomaly? It's just something that's only found there and has nothing else to do with the Roman Empire or anything else. You think that there is a connection there?
That's a specifically Indian development in much the same way as there are particular types of labyrinth that develop in particular corners of the world, shall we say. Like, for instance, the man in the maze design in Arizona and New Mexico. That design is very much specific to that one, corner down in the Southwest, but, and originated in Arizona. So you get these particular types of labyrinths that spring up in one particular area, but then spread within that contained area. So you get like Chakravyuha designs in India, you get the Baltic designs in southern Scandinavia and northern Germany, you've got the man in the maze designs in Arizona and the American Southwest. Labyrinths develop in that way and spring up, and a design that has a particular purpose, a particular meaning and a particular attraction can then spread quite widely within a particular region.
So you think that there are instances where it has to do with the society with at that time, that and there's a different type of need than just something that's brought by an advancing civilization, or conquering civilization or technology, the change in technology, that it's. Do you understand what I'm asking? Is there a difference in the need?
Yes, I mean, in much the same way, take for instance the man in the maze baskets. The man in the maze design from Arizona. That first appears literally just over 100 years ago. It does not exist prior to that time in that particular form. And that's because it was created as a basket weaving pattern. And it was the placing of that design on the baskets that were being woven in Arizona that were being sold to tourists and collectors in the early 20th century that created a way for the Native American tribes that live down in southern Arizona to use their basket weaving skills to earn some money. And that kind of perpetuated that symbol, but that symbol very rapidly became a symbol of their tribal identity. So now there's a number of different tribal groupings in that region that use the man in the maze design specifically to symbolize their cultural identity. So that's got nothing much to do with an invading culture or somebody. No. It's actually to do with kind of traders and East Coast collectors coming out to Arizona looking for artifacts to take back to sell in their galleries back on the East Coast. And the locals kind of taking advantage of that. But once again, the labyrinths kind of piggybacked on that little piece of cultural activity, and went on to become this symbol, which if you go down to Sells or somewhere like that down in southern Arizona, south of Tucson, on the Tohono O'odham reservation there. Go around the reservation, you'll see labyrinths painted on the fire trucks. It's on the license plates of all the official vehicles on the reservation. It's on the front of the courthouse. It's on the school buildings. It's everywhere because it has become their symbol.
Yeah. And I thought it had to do with the myth of Initi,
of Itoi, yes.
Yeah, Itoi,
yes.
and yeah.
Yes.
And it was the representation of his journey, but not able to. It's normally not able to enter that center circle because you can't, as a human being, you can't go into the divine. You can't.
Well, the story runs that that it represents the path that leads to his hidden house that is at the top of the sacred mountain. So yes, I mean, that story is many hundreds, many thousands of years old, but the use of that specific man in the maze symbol to represent that story, and therefore the founding of the tribe and their identity as a whole, goes back just over 100 years.
And what do you think the chakra you have? What's the background with that?
Well, that is a similar kind of thing. That represents the battle plan of one of the tribal groups in India, and one of these great battles that's in the Mahabharata, that it becomes a symbol of that particular winning battle side. And that design therefore becomes popular because it's carved on the temples and it's in the manuscripts, etc., etc. And at some stage somebody has created that design. I mean, we know a bit less about that one because that's clearly much further back in time. I mean, you can find examples of that chakra viewer design that are at least 1,000 years old. So clearly it goes back much further. And the origins of it are even further back in time and more difficult to unravel. But once again, once a particular labyrinth design becomes popular, it has a purpose, it symbolizes something important to a particular culture, that design perpetuates itself over and over again, and can survive for many hundreds and indeed thousands of years.
So what about the Gothic Revival period? You had tons of labyrinths being put back into churches that had been torn out.
Well, not necessarily ones that have been torn out, often into completely new buildings.
Completely new buildings, yeah.
Because those labyrinths that were built in the 19th century there, a lot of those are connected essentially with a period in European history in the mid-19th century where, particularly in the British Isles and the Netherlands, for instance, where Catholicism, which had been outlawed for many hundreds of years, became a legal religion again. And part of the whole reason that there were these labyrinths being built is because there were lots of new Catholic churches being built in the Netherlands and in the British Isles. And the architects that were building them went to go to, particularly to France, to go and see the great Gothic cathedrals for inspiration. And guess what? They saw labyrinths and put those labyrinths into these churches that were built 150 years ago. And indeed, it was one of those labyrinths that was built by the Rockefellers in the late 1920s at Riverside Church in Manhattan that became the oldest labyrinth in a church in the United States in 1928, 1929.
Yeah, it's a beautiful labyrinth. I've been there many times. So do you think this is just an architectural construct, sort of reflecting as a romantic idea of a pure Gothic age? John Ruskin, he talks about the sacrifice of the stone carvers and intricately decorating every stone. That Gothic buildings were excelled above all other architecture. Do you think it was just a response to that?
Yes, some of them are the work of architects, and indeed it was architects and historians who were writing about these ancient and medieval labyrinths in the sort of early mid 1800s. that built or that started to document the medieval and earlier labyrinths in historical and archaeological papers, that then inspired the architects to build these things in the churches that they were either building anew or restoring in the mid-19th century. So some of them are very much architectural features, but it's the same time that there are lots of mazes being built in pleasure gardens and parks and so forth. And it's also a time where there are some labyrinths being made as well. Some of the turf labyrinths that we have, well, one that still survives at Dalby in North Yorkshire dates from the 1860s, and there was certainly one or two in southern Scotland that are also from that same time, inspired by those architectural, archaeological papers. People, see these labyrinth designs and think, oh, I'll make one of those. So some of them are high art, and some of them are just, on village greens. They're nothing particularly, exotic or fancy at all. I'm currently, for instance, researching a labyrinth that I have that I acquired recently. That's on a wooden writing box. That was probably made by a French prisoner of war at a prison camp in Scotland at sometime during the Napoleonic Wars at the beginning of the 19th century. So labyrinths were, in circulation at that time, not just amongst architects, but also amongst soldiers and sailors.
So the present desire to walk labyrinths today, their need to walk labyrinths today, do you think it's very different from documented uses from ancient medieval Nordic societies, for example?
It would appear to have some similarities, but also a considerable number of differences. You have to bear in mind that when you're trying to compare the way that modern labyrinths are being used to how labyrinths are being used in the past, that anything much more than a century or so ago, frankly, we really don't know too much about how they were being used. There's a few clues, there's some folklore, there's even a few eyewitness accounts, but by and large, a lot of it is supposition and best guesses. The modern use of labyrinths, particularly in this last, let's say, 25 years or so, where labyrinths are particularly being walked as a spiritual practice, as a fairly kind of contemplative, solemn practice even, doesn't necessarily correspond with how they were used in the past. The turf labyrinths here in England, for instance, much of what we think we know about those, once again, largely from folklore rather than any eyewitness accounts, would suggest that they were mostly used for village fairs and fetes and festivals, that they were a dancing ground for children and for the young men and women of the town and the village to go and dance around at particular high days and holidays. So they would have been used, in a slightly different way. And if you go back to the medieval cathedrals, then what little we know suggests that they were used very much as part of a ritual dance at Easter. Which would seem quite strange, perhaps, to modern ways of thinking about how labyrinths are used. Certainly, when people go and walk on some of the labyrinths in the French cathedrals now with their modern ideas, that kind of can sit a little uneasy sometimes with the cathedral authorities, because they would prefer they were still used in the old-fashioned medieval way.
Well, then
whatever that was.
Yeah, whatever they needed to bring a ball with a thread or something or other, and
yes.
know how to dance the tripodiya.
they'd need a ball and to know the dance step and to sit and play some medieval music in the background to accompany it. Yeah.
Yeah. But that harkens back to what they know, I think, about the Cretan labyrinth and the Minoan and what they use.
Well, careful of the word Minoan.
Sorry, Cretan.
If you know of any Minoan labyrinths, I'd dearly love to know about them,
Sorry.
because there's no one found one yet.
What they say transpired in the areas of the spirit, the religious areas in Cretan, and the Cretan palaces there. They called it a dance floor. And there's a possibility that there was a connection. It's all supposition because they don't really know. Yeah.
Yes.
But it's fun to imagine all of the women dancing and the bull dancers and that whole thing. It's very fantastical.
And it's also rather interesting to kind of try to figure out what the labyrinth petroglyphs that are carved in Galicia, a number of labyrinths carved on rock faces in northwestern Spain, which would appear to be somewhat older than any of the buildings at Knossos. What is that symbol doing over on the Atlantic coast, some hundreds of years before the labyrinth story supposedly was founded on the island of Crete, and possibly the best part of 1,000 years before the first symbol of it is found in the Mediterranean, on the clay tablet from Pylos, which is Mycenaean, not Minoan. But that early history of labyrinths is so difficult to untangle, because we have just a handful of examples from that early period, and it's very difficult a lot of them it's very difficult to date them with any accuracy, and a lot of them it's very difficult to figure out what the connections between them all are, and certainly we've got no idea how any of them were being used.
Yeah. So let's go to your personal journey. What had you decide to create a labyrinth journal, Cardroia, 4 years or so after you became aware of labyrinths?
Well, this was, like I say, back in the days before the internet. It was back in the days when if you wanted to talk to someone, if you knew their phone number, you could give them a call, but if it was long distance, that was quite a challenge. And it was back in the days when you used to get a sheet of paper out and write a letter and then put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it and run it down to the post office. And back in the mid-1970s, when I first discovered labyrinths and got enthusiastic about them, keeping in contact with other people who you bumped into along the way who shared that enthusiasm, when you were writing letters backwards and forwards, it was what you did, but it got a bit tedious. And I kind of pretty soon came to the realization that with all these people that I was writing to and were writing to me about labyrinths, and when I say all of them, we're talking about several dozen here. If I created a little newsletter and sent it round to all of those people, I could keep all of those people in the loop much more effectively. And that's how it all kind of started. That in 1980, I produced a little newsletter, and there were 30 copies of it printed, shall we say, on a works photocopier late one night when no one else was around. And this was back in the days when photocopiers were pretty fancy bits of kit. These were not the sort of things that most folk had sitting in their office at home. Indeed, you either had to go down to a printer's and pay through the nose for the use of one, or you worked for a big organisation that had a reprographics section, with people who knew how to fix photocopiers and to put toner into them and all kinds of weird things that you had to do to keep them running. They were quite sophisticated and complicated pieces of equipment. So I started this little newsletter to keep really these folk that I'd run into over the years in touch with each other, and that was, well, 1980, so what, 38 years ago, long time ago.
And at first, so you know what you say about it, the Cardoria, is that you have a number of different things, a number of different types of entries in that just came about because of this interaction with people and what people were interested in and made you aware of, et cetera, and then your own exploration and research.
Yeah, and it was about building on what was available at the time, because bear in mind that, once again, you go back to that point in time, there were several books on the subject. The principal one being W.H. Matthews' Mazes and Labyrinths, that was written in 1922. And there was Janet Bald's Labyrinths and Mazes picture book that came out in 1976 that added a little bit of information, but mostly just pictures. And that was the library back in those days, and it was these bits of information that were coming in from people about their local labyrinths and mazes that had not been written down and recorded before, that I was keen to document and to put into those early editions of Cardoria. And that remains very much its raison d'etre to this day, that it is about documenting new discoveries and presenting this material from around the world. I mean, back in the early days, it was really about my group of labyrinth enthusiasts that I kind of put together here in England, and then the rest of the British Isles, and then some Europeans that got interested in it as well. But of course, over time, it became a worldwide phenomenon.
Mm. And what about the Worldwide Labyrinth Locator? Was this, how did that whole thing get started? Was this another offshoot?
How did it get started? That's a long and winding road in itself. It started back with the founding of the Labyrinth Society. Not long after the society was founded and the society put together a website, one of the initial ideas was to have on that website a labyrinth locator, which was very similar to the one that Viriditas had on their website at the time, but most of the Viriditas entries were for the labyrinths that their facilitators owned or had created. So mostly canvas labyrinths, or labyrinths that they put into their backyard or maybe into local communities, or their local churches, etc. Whereas the labyrinth locator that was originally on the TLS website, and this is going back, probably 18 years ago. It was largely the work of Sig Lonergan and his friend Barry Hoon, who was a computer programmer who lived in Glastonbury. And they put together a labyrinth locator on the early TLS website that, as I recall, had getting on for a couple of hundred mainly public labyrinths in the British Isles, in America and in Europe. Particularly quite a few of the historic ones were listed. But unfortunately, the TLS website was hacked and all of the data got wiped. So all that effort that had been put in over the first couple of years was lost. And it was at that point, and I believe this goes back, if you look back through the documents, because I was checking this the other day, to around about 2001, 2002, when TLS started to talk about, so what if we created a proper labyrinth locator? And it was in the summer of 2002, in fact, at the TLS event that we, Sig and Karen Lonergan, and Kimberly and myself staged in Glastonbury, where we met with Lauren Artress from Viriditas, and first discussed this idea of putting our respective resources together, of using the Veriditas labyrinth locator, which they still had online, but was very out of date and riddled with duplication because it had no active moderation or administration. People were just free to upload their details, and if they couldn't find them again, they uploaded them again and then again and then again. And the discussion centered around, well, how would we make this work? Could Veriditas and TLS work together and jointly fund the setting up of an online searchable database? And that was the summer of 2002, and it was May in 2004 when that actually happened. And I was appointed the administrator of that website because I think people had this sort of notion that I knew a bit about labyrinths and where they were.
And you've been the administrator ever since?
And I've been the administrator ever since. Yeah. And now, as of this very moment, I'm looking here at the screen, and there are 5,669 active listings in the database. So getting on for 5,700. And if you assume that represents, well, you can argue yourself between yourselves about what percentage of the world's labyrinths are actually listed in the database there. If you think that half of them are there, that's over 10,000 labyrinths around the world. Depending upon whether you're a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of person. You can decide how many you think are actually represented, but it certainly represents a very important slice, a sample of the many, many different labyrinths that are currently in existence around the world.
Well, I know it's not an easy task to take people's information, find out if it's accurate and factual, and also keep up with labyrinths that die. I mean, I'm not going to use that word die,
they
but
come and go. Absolutely,
they come and go. They do come and go. And
they certainly do.
When I moved to Texas here, I went to a number of them, and they were just shrubs or painted over, that they weren't there anymore. So what's been the most rewarding aspect of this administrator duties that you've had?
I think the most interesting thing is seeing how labyrinths reach distant corners of the globe. Much of the time I'm getting labyrinths listed in the USA, in Canada, familiar territory. And then once in a while, someone will upload one in Armenia or Uzbekistan, or somewhere where you think, really, how did labyrinths get there? And when you actually look at those listings, you can look at the design that they're using, you can go and look at the website link that they give, and kind of piece together some of those clues about, somebody's been attended this event, or they've been on that facilitation course, or they've taken something from their own regional history and culture. And it's about being able to watch how labyrinths spring up in unexpected places, and how particular designs of labyrinths over the years have developed, and particular designs have become very popular. For one reason or another, because ones like the Labyrinth and Shark Cathedral remain very popular because it's the Labyrinth and Shark Cathedral. But there are other simple 5-circuit labyrinths that have become very popular, for instance, because they're quite small and compact, or you can make them reasonably sized but with good wide paths so that they are wheelchair accessible and things like that. And it's very interesting to see how old designs, new designs flourish and develop according to how and where they're being used.
Has a new one come across your desk that has absolutely compelled you to drop everything that you are doing and find it, or go see it, or travel to it? Or...
Oh yeah. We've been to see quite a few of these ones, that somebody lists it and you think, wow. I need to go see that one and to go investigate that one. There's a couple that are in the Labyrinth locator that at some stage in the next 12 months or so, when the weather's right and we can get, one of the great things about being in Europe is the ability to get sort of low cost flights at short notice to just about anywhere in the far-flung corners of Europe, sometimes for kind of like $50 each way or some such, if you fly at a strange time and don't take any baggage with you. So there's several unusual locations that are on my current to-do list. One of them, for instance, that I did last year was to go and look at the labyrinth graffiti that was carved in the dungeon of a castle just outside Alicante in the south of Spain, which is probably somewhere in the region of 500-600 years old, and one of the most peculiar classical labyrinths that I've ever seen, with a very complicated seed pattern, quite unlike anything else. And it's just a piece of graffiti on the wall of a dungeon, done by probably a fairly obviously educated, could well have been a sort of a local nobleman that happened to be on the wrong side during the complex politics of the time in that region, who was held in this dungeon at some stage, and he scratched this beautiful labyrinth on the wall of his prison. And that was one that I found out about on the internet, and you kind of think, yeah, okay, I've got to go and see that. We've got to go and investigate what that actually is. Because sometimes, local folk know they're there, but they don't actually know quite what the value of these things or the importance of them are. And that's what keeps me on the road and sleuthing, as you so nicely put it.
Oh, I think I would do the same thing. In a nanosecond, if I lived over there and had that background, and it makes perfect sense to me. Because you find, what must have been like for this? He had a lot of time on his hands.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He was fairly well
adjacent
educated.
Wall, there's a whole load of those, as you see in the movies. The prisoner that sits there and does another line every day, and at the end of the week draws a line through it.
Yeah.
And on one of the adjacent walls, there's a whole load of those, lines all drawn with little dashes through them for how many days and weeks those prisoners have been held there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my golly, that is so fascinating.
And in same way that the little wooden box that I'm researching at the moment, who's done by a French prisoner of war, and he's made this wooden box presumably for his captors, the Scottish military. But he's familiar with labyrinths, obviously, from back home in France, and he has created in inlaid wooden marquetry a labyrinth on the top of this wooden writing box that he's made for an officer at the prison camp where he's being held.
Wow. So they have stories. They have incredible stories. Wow.
They do, and it is those stories, particularly, that make some of those examples so fascinating to go figure out. You can look at a photo of that thing, but actually to go and see them in person, and to look at them in context, and to figure out why they are there, why just there, and how did they get there. That has really been the driving force behind much of my research work for the last 40 years.
It certainly would keep you enthusiastic, I would imagine, and energized, for sure.
Yep. Always a new one to go and see.
Well, I just want to take a moment here, Jeff, to add, we have two people who are actually on the call with us. And if either one of you would like to unmute yourselves and ask Jeff a question now, it's about 10 to 2 my time. So if anyone would like to unmute yourself and identify yourself and where you're from, maybe, and ask Jeff a question, go right ahead. Sometimes
hi, Jeff.
Oh, hi.
This is Robin Dilly.
Hello.
And I've really enjoyed your presentation today. Can you speak a little bit to what you'll be presenting on at the conference? And you may have done that at the very beginning. I was about 10 minutes late.
Okay. The topic that I'll be looking at is really how the enthusiasm and the interest for labyrinths has developed, and I'm going to go back quite some way. Particularly, I'm going to go back to that early 19th century period when those first historians and architects, archaeologists, antiquarians, all of these different groups of people with an interest in labyrinths started to put together their knowledge and record what they knew about them. Because it is that gathering and pooling of that knowledge, and particularly the designs of the labyrinths, that then started to appear in papers and journals and books at the time, that spread that knowledge of different labyrinth designs in different locations, particularly around Europe, that became the building blocks upon which all of modern study of the subject, and indeed much of the modern enthusiasm of the subject, is built, because it was those people that documented those labyrinths in the churches and cathedrals that provided the plans that allowed the architects to build new replicas in the 19th and early 20th century churches. How that first labyrinth got into the church at Riverside in Manhattan in the 1920s. And it was those enthusiasts back in the 19th century who were the founding fathers, as it were, but not all of them were men, that then was the bedrock for the enthusiasm in the 1960s and 70s, with the first flowering of the modern labyrinth enthusiasm, that then developed in the 1980s with the dowsers, and then in the 1990s with the more spiritually orientated groups, for where we are today. And of course, where we are today, part of that story was the gathering together of a group of enthusiasts in America who founded the Labyrinth Society. There was another group of them. So I'm going to go, back to 150 years or so ago, to where that story starts, and how it's built successively over generations to a point where in the 1990s a group of people got together over several weekends over the course of 4 years to found the Labyrinth Society.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Would the other person like to identify themselves, or are they, if you're just listening, that's totally fine too. I have a couple of more questions for Jeff, so if no one responds, I will continue. Okay, so I wanted to ask you the other publication that you you do specifically for the Labyrinth Society is Labyrinth Pathways. And I think you and Kimberly, your wife, and Labyrinth Psychic, I think she's a trusted Labyrinth Psychic.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. 20 years or more.
Yeah, and you've been very instrumental, both of you, with TLS. She's on the board, etc. So, what has it been like with you publishing this Labyrinth Pathways for the Labyrinth Society, and can you share a story or two about that?
Well, obviously, along with producing Car Dryer, which I've produced now for 38 years, 12 years ago, we founded Labyrinth Pathways as a journal specifically focused for the readership of TLS. Indeed, we've actually literally up until a couple of hours ago, we're sitting here wrangling the latest set of articles through the editorial mill for the new edition that will be out hopefully sometime next week. And around this kind of time of year, late summer, we put out the appeals that TLS members will see coming through with their emails for submissions. And every year, another pile of stories and poetry and all kinds of things get sent to us, and we spend many hours working through that material with the authors. working out the illustration for them, editing their text, making suggestions. And it's quite a pleasure to see those kinds of topics that interest and appeal to people. This new edition, for instance, quite by coincidence, has 3 articles that are essentially about pilgrimages. One to go and see a labyrinth in St. Petersburg, in a church or actually a cathedral in St. Petersburg in Russia. One to go and see a familiar friend, the labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral, and another to go and see another labyrinth in a cathedral, or rather a basilica, a large church in northern France at St. Quentin. A number of people will be familiar with it, but it's one that's less frequently visited. And so this edition has these 3 pieces about pilgrimage, quite coincidental, but that's part of the joy of editing, that these themes pop up and we can have great fun structuring the magazine each time around those pieces.
Wonderful. So, in terms of the Labyrinth Society and your very deep involvement with it, you and Kimberly. So, and because you live across the pond in Great Britain, what do you believe is the biggest challenge for the Labyrinth Society going forward? Pertaining to the labyrinth community outside of the USA. I mean, we talked about technology bringing us all together.
Yeah, and I think it is fostering that sense of togetherness, isn't it? Which is always going to be the challenge. I think certainly with a lot of the work that TLS has done in recent years with World Labyrinth Day, with its internet presence, with its social media presence, allows people from all corners of the world to feel connected and part of the story and in touch with each other, even if getting to the gatherings each year is just simply too far to travel or too expensive. Particularly here in Britain at the moment, travel to America has become a very expensive proposition since our currency was chronically devalued quite recently by a certain political decision that's been taken here. So travel for some folk is very easy, and particularly here in Europe for us it's very easy to travel around, but long distance travel, because of the fact that jet fuel's all priced in dollars, and the various taxes that are levied on air travel, those things are expensive for people. But it's about finding those ways of being inclusive, of bringing in people from around the world, from all different cultures and different backgrounds, I think is the thing that TLS really has to work on, and indeed has succeeded on a number of levels, and can surely find more ways as new channels and new technologies come along.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Thank you so much. And thank you, Robin, for jumping in there and asking that question. And I just love having people who are on with us and are willing to, unmute themselves and ask the questions. And it always brings another layer of juiciness to the podcast, the episode. So thank you so much, Robin, for contributing in that way. And I'm going to say that, it's at 1:58, and I just really can't wait to see you both at the gathering, Jeff, and listen to your entire presentation. And that's another area. You're talking about technology, recording pieces of the gathering, specifically the featured presenter pieces, that for people for later on, and having these recordings available to the members and to the larger Labyrinth community. So TLS is working on that, and we're looking at that because yes, I think the current board is very aware that we have to, and many of us are sort of dinosaurish in terms of some of the newer social media technologies, and we're having to learn all of that. But I think you're very spot on about what TLS has to look at in terms of what's next and going forward, and really helping the worldwide labyrinth community uh, enjoy all of the different types of things that TLS has to offer, even if they can't be there in person. That
Yeah.
they have access to the information.
Yep.
So
very important.
Yeah. So I think we're gonna. It's exactly 2:00. Perfect timing. It's really been a pleasure sharing this hour with you, Jeff. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And many continued blessings on your path, and please give my best to Kimberly when she comes home,
I will indeed.
Okay, and have a
I'll
good
see
trip.
you and many other people at the gathering in not much more than a month's time now.
Yes, and have a safe journey to the States, and see you in Chicago.
See you in early October in Chicago. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much.
So you've been listening to the Labyrinth Society's Many Paths, Many Visions on GoToMeeting, and broadcast by Spreaker with your host, Christiana Brinton. Be sure to check the TLS website, media area, Facebook page, global group, YouTube, and Google Plus for a list of upcoming dates and guests. Also, if this podcast has piqued your interest in the Labyrinth Society and you'd like more information about membership, please go to www.labyrinthsociety.org/membership. Ciao, namaste, and may you find what you need on your path through life.